All right, well, welcome everybody. Thank you so much for coming tonight. We're so excited to have all of you here and those of you on Zoom as well. Welcome to you too. My name is Emily Krachevsky and I am the site manager here at the Heritage Center. And we've got lots of events coming up. We do have some flyers up at the front desk, so feel free to check those out before you head out today. They're also online as well. To introduce our speaker for this evening, I had to write down all of the organizations and groups that he is in because there are just so many. This is one involved person that we are about to hear, very experienced person in the world of speaking. And
which is just somebody who hasn't learned Groucho's dictum about not wanting to be a member of the club or having as a member.
We'll stay in here. Stay here. So just to name a few, so this is Ken Engel, obviously. He is going to be talking to us tonight about a variety of topics, including about how his parents survived the Holocaust. So he is a member of the Speakers Bureau Community Relations Council of Minnesota and the Dakotas / Tolerance Minnesota and the JCRC Middle East Speakers Bureau. He's also the chair of the Children of the Holocaust Survivors Association of Minnesota and a member of the Coordinating Council of Generations of the Shoah International, which is a US-based group of second generation and other Holocaust-related organizations. Did I miss any?
I'm not going to say.
Okay, may have missed a few there, but very, very involved, obviously a very accomplished speaker as well. His wife is in attendance tonight as well. And they live in the Bryn Mawr neighborhood in Minneapolis and very much enjoy all of their children and grandchildren as well. So we are very fortunate to have him. Thank you all so much for coming. And I will turn it over to Ken Engel. Yeah.
Thank you, Emily.
You're welcome.
Thank you, everyone, for being here. Thank you for the folks who are here online. I'm going to talk for a little while and then we're going to have a Q&A, but I'm going to start with a couple ground rules, just for purposes so you understand partly what I'm talking about. Two things. Number one, you will not hear me from this point on use the word Holocaust. Holocaust is from the ancient Greek word that's holocauston, that stood for a sacred burnt offering. And I believe it's highly inappropriate to use that word to refer to what happened to European Jewry during and before World War II. I prefer the word Shoah, which is the Hebrew word for the annihilation. And that defines, I think, in a capsuled way, exactly what the Germans intended to do to all of the Jews in the entire world. So I think I like the word Shoah. That's what I'll use. Second is that from this point on, you will also not hear me use the word Nazi. I will use the word German or Germans. Why? Because I'm going to break my rule already by saying the word again. If I say Nazi, what is likely to occur to each of you is you're going to go to a stereotype of a human being. Black suited, black hatted, tall, blonde hair, blue eyed. It's going to be a stereotype, a non-existent entity, but you're going to have that image likely in mind. And I don't want you to run with that image. The reason in part why is because the people who perpetrated this and their collaborators, the Germans, the Austrians, et cetera, were human beings just like each of us. And not only were they human beings, but each of us could, in the right or the wrong set of circumstances, depending on how you look at it, do exactly what the Germans did to the Jews and other undesirables during World War II. So those are a couple of housekeeping points. As I said, I'm going to talk for a little bit about a number of things, then we'll have a Q&A. I'm going to ask you please to hold your questions until after I'm done. It's not that I don't like interruptions. I'm used to interruptions. I won't tell you why. But no, not my sweetie. It just, things will flow, I think, a little better. So why don't we get started? Let's initially talk about, essentially answer a question that a lot of people have about why were the Jews marked for extermination by the Germans? There have been many, many theories over the years. One of the theories was that Adolf Hitler's wife, Clara Hitler, was treated by a Jewish doctor named Edward Bloch. She had breast cancer in 1907. She was dying from it. He treated her. He couldn't stop the cancer. She died. A lot of people have said Hitler basically created this great rage and hatred in him because this Jewish doctor couldn't save his mother, and he then associated that with all Jews in the world. Not true, because amongst other things, this physician who got out of Germany in 1939, but Hitler sent this physician multiple postcards that on the reverse side, Hitler painted street scenes, bucolic scenes, pastoral scenes, and thanked him for what he did. And this doctor, Dr. Bloch, was one of the very few Jews in Germany that Hitler marked as untouchable. Nobody's going to do anything to him. Leave him alone. So that theory didn't hold up. Another theory is that Hitler developed this hatred based on the widespread anti-Semitism that existed in Austria, where Hitler was from, and in Germany, going back to before even the middle of the 19th century. Well, that could be, but then the question comes up. So why did the Germans wait over 100 years before they carried this campaign out? That answer of widespread, longstanding anti-Semitism doesn't cover it either. There are a lot of other theories that have been thrown out, but I think actually the answer to the question, why the Jews, why were we singled out for extermination, is found in Hitler's so-called autobiography, Mein Kampf. Anybody hear of the book Mein Kampf? I see a few nodding heads. Mein Kampf was written by Hitler while he was imprisoned after a failed putsch in Munich in 1924, but he had rather luxurious prison accommodations, and he took his time amongst other things, and he wrote this diatribe. And when he used the title Mein Kampf, My Struggle, he wasn't really talking about himself, he was talking about the German nation, about Germany was involved in this great struggle. What struggle? Hitler had this view that all life on this planet, particularly all mammals on this planet, were involved in a never-ending fight and struggle for limited resources. Food, for example. And from Hitler's view, anything went. You could do anything that you wanted to try to garner what share of these limited resources you could get your hands on. Well, how did this relate to Germany and Germans? Well, Hitler also had this view, and anybody stop me when this starts sounding crazy. Like, you could stop me now because it is crazy. His point of view was that Germany was destined to rule the world. It was in their genes, in their blood. Nobody else was as good as the Germans, even though he was Austrian. And that he felt that the reason that Germans did not realize their destiny, even though there were no rules, you could do anything you wanted to garner these scarce resources, is because there were problems that were presented to the Germans that distracted them from realizing this rule of the world. Remember the Tears for Fears song, Everyone Wants to Rule the World? They were right. The Germans did, according to Hitler, but it didn't work. Why? What distracted them? Hitler's view was that it was the Jew, not the Jews, it was the Jew that was there that kept Germans from realizing their ultimate potential. And so where did he get this idea? Well, in part, he got this idea. He looked to the United States and how we handled our Native American and our Black issues. And he admired the United States for what it did to suppress these minorities. He thought exactly the right thing to do, exterminate them, wipe them out of the way, take their land, and go about your business. He thought that was the right thing to do. It may not be comfortable for us to think about that, to even know that we were an example that motivated Hitler to do what he wanted to do, but facts are facts. In Mein Kampf, he lauds what the United States did in 4 different places to a great extent. In fact, as strange as it sounds, if you haven't read Mein Kampf yet, I really encourage you, when you have a lot of time, to read it. It's a crazy set of ramblings, irrational pointers, finger pointing, all kinds of stuff. But you'll really understand, I think, a lot better once you read this book. How did the Germans get to where they did, so that they were pinpointing and earmarking undesirables who they felt were in their way, prevented them from realizing their destiny. The other thing is that Hitler, like, why pick the Jews? Still, that question hasn't been answered. Well, he answers it in Mein Kampf. In Mein Kampf, he discusses that the Jews were an ecological, an existential, and a genetic threat to Germans. Anybody buy that? He discussed, I didn't expect to get anybody to raise their hand. He discussed that, number one, the Jews had created all of these distractions. And what were these distractions? Distractions were such things as philosophy, psychology, history, economics, art, music, all of these things that would distract the Germans from realizing their destiny. And he said it was the Jews that came up with all of these things that kept Germany from becoming what it was supposed to be. And so what was Hitler's solution? No pun intended. Hitler's solution to this problem was wipe out every Jew on the map. Because as long as there's one Jew left in the world, they're going to create these systems that are going to go back and distract Germans from doing what they're supposed to do. In fact, he said, you could wipe out every Jew in the world but one, which if you do that, supposedly all these systems go up in smoke. But Hitler said, no, if there's even one Jew left, they will recreate all of these distractions, keep Germany from doing what it's supposed to be doing. Any of this make sense? There was a genetic problem from Hitler's standpoint. Hitler believed that the Jews were genetically inferior to Germans. Now, I'm not going to get into a discussion about, well, there were 550,000 Jews in Germany in 1933, and they were German. But Hitler didn't bother about that distinction. As far as he was concerned, if you were a Jew, you couldn't be anything else. So this whole idea, if we allow these impure people to mix with us, both physically and sexually, not sure what that was, we're going to degrade the German gene pool and weaken Germans' ability to rule the world. And then there's the extension. Hello, come on in. Then there's the existential view, which again, because of all these things, Jews are just an automatic threat. Can't allow them to be in place because they interfere with German destiny and Germans reaching their highest potential. So as crazy as these ideas were and are, more than 55 million Germans embrace these ideas. Why? Because they were rewarded to embrace them, because they were prepared to embrace them, because they were programmed or self-programmed to do so. So that's how we became the objects of somebody's attention. So let me then talk, I'm going to focus on one Jew. And the Jew that I'm going to talk about with other people is our father. Not that one, mine, my sweeties. His name was Engel, Michael in English. He was born in 1921 in Eastern Czechoslovakia. We'll see that in a little bit. Just outside of a town called Munkac, which was very close to Hungary and very close to Romania. He was the oldest of 7 children. He was the favorite of his mother, Ahuva Engel, who's there. And he grew up in a very, very Orthodox Jewish home, very observant. And he was, and that, by the way, was his dad, Pinchas. Excuse me. That was Pinchas, his dad. And again, he was the favorite of his mom. He went to both a Hungarian public school because they were very close. I'm sorry, a Ukrainian public school because they were very close to Ukraine. And he also went in the afternoons and early evenings to a Jewish school called a cheder. And a cheder is where you study Jewish subjects, especially the Talmud, the 5 books of what some people refer to as the Old Testament, the prophets, etc. By the time our dad was 16, sorry, it's a small picture. He wasn't a small man, short, but not small. By the time he was 16, he was already a Talmudic scholar, which was an amazing achievement because that usually didn't happen until you were in your late 20s to early 30s at the earliest. And his path was basically to become a learned person of his community, a leader, and that was his goal. This photograph was taken in 1937. Now, 1937, there were all kinds of problems brewing in Europe. However, his studies at the cheder were interrupted by 1939, and how that happened was in September of 1938. Adolf Hitler, who I think you've heard the name, threatened 2 of the Western allies, Great Britain and France, that he would immediately begin to wage war against those countries unless they gave him land they had no right or title to, which was the western part of Czechoslovakia and the eastern part at some point. And he said, this map, as you can see, Munkac is at the very, very far right corner of that brown highlighted area, which is Czechoslovakia. You can see Romania is close by, Hungary is here, Poland is up there, and Ukraine is right over here. And now, in fact, that portion of Europe is now part of Ukraine. But Hitler said, you give me Western Czechoslovakia, which included Prague, the capital, and I promise no war, I'll be done, we'll be satisfied, no issue. Anybody ever heard of a trade of land for peace working long-term? It didn't work well for Native Americans in this country. It's never worked as far as I know of historically. But United States and Great Britain were Great Britain and France were eager to avoid war. And they thought, fine. The irony is that by agreeing to divvy up the western part of Czechoslovakia, at the time, Czechoslovakia's military forces were stronger than the buildup that Hitler was carrying out in Germany. Czechoslovakia could have probably, we don't know, this is hypothetical, but probably could have defeated or at least held Germany to a standstill if the war came up. But it didn't matter to Great Britain and France. They said, okay, fine, you got a deal, no war, everybody goes home, except of course, for the people living in this area. Well, that was in September of 1938, and some of you may have remembered seeing photographs of Neville Chamberlain, who then was the Prime Minister of Great Britain, who returned to London and held up what he said was a peace agreement, and he declared peace in our time. Well, our time lasted only until March of 1939. In fact, it didn't even last that long because the Hungarians in November of 1938 saw an opportunity. They took this portion for the court of Czechoslovakia. They invaded it, they occupied it, and Germany was fine with that for a while. March of 1939, Hitler seems to have forgotten his promise, and German troops march into eastern Czechoslovakia. They leave the Hungarians in control of that southeastern corner of Czechoslovakia. And there's still no war. It's March of 39. But 6 months later, Hitler decided he needed Lebensraum, that's living space, for the expanding German population. So he invaded on September 1st. Look at that, I can even get it right. This is what Europe looked like on September 1, 1939. Czechoslovakia is that tiny little sliver in the middle. You'll see it's the right side, the eastern side is crosshatched. The far right portion of that is where Munkach was, where our dad lived and his family. And the western part was, of course, fully occupied by Germany. Anyway, the war starts on September 1, 1939. Germany invades Poland. The Soviet Union waits a week and they invade Poland from the east. And Great Britain and France declare war on Germany to try to stop this. What happened to the people living in Munkach at that time? Well, interestingly, while the Germans were carrying out a vicious program in Western Czechoslovakia, applying measures that were extremely prejudicial, let's call them, to the Jews and other undesirables in Western Czechoslovakia, Eastern Czechoslovakia, the Germans said, we'll wait, no rush. We won't address what they called the Jewish question. And they waited. Our dad, who is now subject to Hungarian rule, and the Hungarians were not very nice to the Jews in that part of Czechoslovakia, he became, in May of 1940, he became a slave laborer. And for the next 4.5 years, separate from his family, he worked in mines, worked to prepare airports, worked in munition factories to produce shells and bullets and rifles. He even worked to sew clothing for the Wehrmacht, which was the German army. He's doing this unpaid, and he's allowed only to come back home once, maybe twice a year to see his family, who still lived just outside of Munkach. No extreme measures were taken against them yet. The last time that our dad saw his family, this was a family excluding him of 76 people. The last time he saw them was in December of 1943. And he traveled back to the family home. In fact, he had a leave that he was granted. And the family gathered around. There was no ghetto established yet in Eastern Czechoslovakia or in Munkach. And the war had already started to turn against the Germans. And his dad, Pinchas, gathered the entire family around and said, look, the war is going to end relatively soon. The Germans are losing. We don't know where we're going to be spread out between now and the end of the war. But when the war ends, everybody gather back in the family home and we'll figure out what we're going to do then. And then our dad had to leave again and go back as a slave laborer. That was the last time he saw all but 2 other members of his family. In March of 1944, the Germans decided we've tolerated the Jews in Eastern Czechoslovakia long enough. We're going to disrupt the Hungarian control of the area. We're going to take over what we rightfully gained, they said. And March 19th of 1944, Germany moved in. Within 1 month, the first ghettos There were two ghettos that were set up in Munkach for the 15,000 Jews who lived still in Munkach out of a total population of 30,000. And for the Jews that lived outside of Munkach in that area, there were two, we'll call them ghettos, but there were two brick factories where those Jews were herded into and waiting their fate. A month later, less than a month later, in fact, the Germans decided that they were going to ship all of the Jews in Eastern Czechoslovakia, in the Munkach area included, on a 240-mile journey north-northwest from Munkach to a town in southwestern Poland called Auschwitz. Anybody hear that name before? Couple. The German word for Auschwitz, and I'm not pronouncing the Polish right, and my apologies. The German word for that town was Auschwitz. The first transports out of Munkach took place on May 11th, 1944. There were 3 trains that left the city and headed northwest to Auschwitz. 75 members of our dad's family were on that first transport out of Munkach, heading to Auschwitz. The only exceptions were our dad, who was a slave laborer at this point in southern Poland, away from Auschwitz, and his next younger brother, Shmuel, who had gotten out of Europe in June of 1940 as part of a Children for Trucks trade. And trucks were given to Germany, and these children were allowed to leave, and he made his way to then Palestine. And he joined an organization called the Irgun. The Irgun was a terrorist organization whose only goal was to push the British who occupied Palestine, push them out of Palestine so Israel could be formed. Anybody see or read, why am I suddenly forgetting the name of the book? Exodus? Mm-hmm. In the film and the book, there's a description of the prison break from a town near the Mediterranean in then Palestine called Acre. And the prison break was 300 people who were in the Irgun who designed a way to get out of the prison. They killed a number of British guards on their way. My uncle, Shmuel, who I'm partly named after, was part of that break. And he quickly tried to find his way back to the Irgun. And because the British were looking for him, he changed his name from Shmuel Engel to a name I don't even know. And eventually the War of Independence started a year later, May of 1948. Shmuel joined what became the IDF, the Israeli Defense Force. And 3 days after the War for Independence started, he was killed. So that only left our dad outside of the family, not heading to Auschwitz. The family arrived in Auschwitz in that first set of trains 30 days later on June 10th. And with the exception of our dad's 2 next younger sisters, Hensha and Leah, everybody else was selected to go to the left in the lines when they arrived, marched 1.5 miles to where the gas chambers were. And on that day, 72 members of our dad's family were murdered. Now, related to this, I haven't mentioned anything about my mother. Her name is Tilly Collis. She grew up not far from our dad, outside of Munkach. Our dad knew her growing up, but he had other romantic interests. Didn't really care much for it. Thank you. I'm glad you picked that up. She was also in that first transport with the other 43 members of her family. They made the same journey. My mother and her sister Tzipora, or Tzipi is the Yiddish nickname, which stands for little bird. They were selected to go to the right. which meant you changed the clothing you wore for a camp outfit of a gray and black tunic and gray sweatpants, let's call them. And if you were lucky, clogs or shoes. Their hair was shaved. They were tattooed. Auschwitz was the only concentration or death camp where the prisoners were tattooed and they were assigned to work. The other 42 members of my mother's family were murdered in the gas chambers that same day. Uncles, aunts, potential nieces, nephews, cousins, grandparents, etc. I never knew any of them. And so our dad doesn't know, however, anything about any of this. The word has not gotten back of what happened to his family. He's working as a slave laborer. My mother is in Auschwitz until January of 1945, when somehow she survived, and she is assigned to one of the 3 death marches out of Auschwitz to go into Germany, because the Germans' intent was, we can't leave these survivors alive, or at least able to be grabbed by the Allies, because they're witnesses to our crimes. We can't possibly let that happen. And the Germans were busy covering up the evidence of their crimes for years, actually, not just in Auschwitz, but every other death camp and many of the concentration camps. So my mother was in a transport, a death march out of Auschwitz, and she headed west into Germany to a camp called Buchenwald, Birchwood. And she was there for 2 months, and then she was transferred to another camp called Bergen-Belsen, which was north and slightly east of there. Any of you heard of the name Bergen-Belsen? Did you hear it in context of Anne Frank? Probably. Okay. Anne Frank that was the last stop for Anne Frank. She was murdered there in March of 1945. My mother never met her, never knew her, but she was in the same place. So my mother, on April 15th, 1945, is liberated by the British Army. She was 22 years old. She was in the full bloom of young womanhood. I've seen one picture of her pre-war. She was quite a beautiful woman. When she was liberated, she weighed 58 pounds. The British who liberated her sent her to one of the British military hospitals in Budapest in Hungary. Well, I'm sorry, it doesn't show there. Budapest is about there for you folks on Zoom. And she was sent to this British military hospital to recover. Our dad, rolling back, in February of 1945, he is now no longer assigned as slave labor. He's now sent to a death camp in northeastern Austria called Mauthausen, which was built on a series of granite chambers and tunnels. And he was there for approximately 3 months. Our dad estimated that while he was there, his only job was to bury bodies, and he estimated he buried 2,900 bodies. Our dad was liberated on May 5th, 1945, by the 11th Armored Division of the US 3rd Army. He remembered what his dad said. Go back to the family home. Everybody gathered there. We'll figure out what we're going to do next. He makes the journey from Mauthausen by rail, by truck, by foot to get back to to get back to Munkac. And on his way, he's in a train car. He and only 2 other people are in this particular train car for part of the journey. He's still wearing his prisoner outfit that he wore in Mauthausen. The other 2 riders are not Jewish, and they see him, and they know, of course, exactly where he was. But one of them asks him, "Are you a Jew?" And our dad said, "Yes." And this guy asked, why do you remain a Jew? After everything that's happened to your people, the decimation, the murder, why do you remain a Jew? And our dad looked this guy straight in the eye and he said, you mean after everything I've been through, I'm going to change now? That shut the guy up. Our dad gets back to Munkach. This is now early June of 1945. He remembers what his dad said. He gets back to the family home and he waits. And he waits for 30 days. Nobody shows up. He doesn't know what's happened to his family. No idea. He knows his brother is in Palestine. That's all that he knows. He doesn't know that he has two sisters who have survived Auschwitz. But they kind of went the wrong way and they ended up behind the Iron Curtain. So he didn't see them for another 20 years. But he waits. He's sitting there for 30 days, essentially, hoping somebody's going to show up. And another Jew who also survived, who also was from Munkach, kind of grabbed him by the arm and said, Mechel, we've got to get out of here. These people are ready to kill us. And our dad listened. Now, there was a very primitive communication system in that portion of Eastern Europe just after World War II. And unlike what was going on, if you may remember after 9/11, there were posters, you probably saw the photographs. There were posters that were plastered up all around southern Manhattan. Person's picture, their name, where they worked, the name of the person who's looking for them. You can contact me at this number. Here's my email address. Please let me know if you have any information about this person. It was a little more primitive in that part of Eastern Europe. And in this case, there was one municipal building still standing in Munkach, and somebody had pasted or thumbtacked a little scrap of paper that said that Celi Kallas, my mother's name, was in a British military hospital in Budapest. The word got to our dad. Our dad thought, well, there's no future here. I've got to get out of here. I'm going to make my way to Budapest to see if I can find her. Maybe I can find her and we can start a new life. Our dad at this point was fluent in 9 languages. Being in concentration camps and death camps, well, and slave labor, it tends to broaden your education in some respects. He made the journey to Budapest. He didn't read or write or speak English yet when he arrived, but somehow he got a listing of the British military hospitals that were in Budapest and their addresses, and he started making his rounds one by one to see if he could find Celi Kallas. I'm told the 16th hospital that he went to, he traveled to a public ward on the 3rd floor of this hospital, and he found her. She was recovering, not very quickly. He stayed by her side while she recovered for another 6 months. When she recovered, they were sent to what was called a displaced persons camp in Germany, in a town called Bamberg, which was actually the site of a former concentration camp. How's that for stirring up memories? They married while they were there. They had 2 children while they were there. And finally, in February of 1949, they were sponsored by my mother's uncle and aunt who lived in New York to emigrate to the United States. You couldn't emigrate to the United States at that time unless somebody could vouch for you that you wouldn't become a public ward. Fine. They're granted these visas. They travel on a ship that crosses the Atlantic. They arrive in New York on March 17th, 1949. What day is March 17th? I can't hear you. St. Patrick's Day. Our dad didn't know that. Took a boat. By this point, Ellis Island was closed for processing immigrants. There was another facility that was used. After the 4 of them were processed through, they took a boat across the Hudson. They landed at the southern tip of Manhattan at a place called Battery Park. It's still March 17th. And our dad said when he walked down the gangplank from the ship onto dry land into Battery Park, he saw the park was filled with people having a wonderful time. But he didn't know that, because he said his thought was one of two things. Either this is a paramilitary group. I mean, Battery Park is 45 acres. It's a big place. It was filled with people having a wonderful time. His view was that this is either a paramilitary group that's celebrating a victory over some poor unfortunates, or they're getting ready to celebrate a victory over some other poor unfortunates. That was theory one. Theory two was that our dad, oh, and I'm sorry, and virtually everybody that he saw in the park was wearing a shamrock button. And he thought they're wearing those buttons to identify themselves to each other. The other theory was that this is actually the secret police. And every once in a while, he thought they show up in public to remind people, we haven't gone away, watch yourselves, don't make a false step or we'll be on you. And these people, almost to a T, were also wearing shamrock buttons. He'd never seen a shamrock button before. And another survivor took him aside while he's seeing this scene and said, Mechel, you've got it all wrong. You don't understand. Today is a day that's sacred to the Irish. It's St. Patrick's Day. In the United States, everybody this one day thinks they're Irish and they celebrate, Our dad bought a shamrock button for the next St. Patrick's Day. This shamrock button is the one he bought. And he wore it on every St. Patrick's Day, including St. Patrick's Day, March 17th, 2010, 2 days before we lost him. And the first 10 years of his life in the United States, a survivor, when he'd be wearing a shamrock button on St. Patrick's Day. No, he didn't drink. Another survivor would come up to him and say, Mechel, what the hell is wrong with you? It's not exactly a Jewish holiday. What are you doing? And our dad said, it was the best day of my life because it was the day I found my freedom. And that shut the person up. So, I'm sorry. This is one of the two ghettos that were located in Munkach starting after March 19th of 1944. One of the two, a real place. This is a photograph after my parents arrived in the United States with these twins, I'll call them. You all, or most of you, have siblings. You know what it's like to have siblings sometimes. You don't go out and celebrate necessarily. Anyway, I'm sorry. This was taken in February of 1954. It was the first family portrait of my family. That's me in the upper right. That's Mechel. That's my mother, Celia, on the far right. And the other two. But now this is almost 5 years after they've arrived in the New World. And they came with nothing. I mean, they had a few photographs. Those photographs of Ahuva and Pinchas, how they survived World War II, I don't know. There were very few photographs that my parents brought from the old world, but those were. But, this is 9 years after the war. And our dad certainly is smiling. Celia is trying to smile, but they've already formed a new life for themselves. That was a pretty amazing accomplishment. So then we jump forward in time. Our dad was revered in all the communities that he served. He was a leader. He was called a Pied Piper of people because people happily followed him. He was somebody who not only wanted the best for somebody, but looked for the best in them. This is all somebody who was a slave laborer for 4.5 years and who worked bearing 2,900 people in a concentration camp near the end of World War II. And he's smiling. That's my sweetie, my Donna, my wife. This was taken in February of 2007 at a banquet honoring our dad and other volunteers by the Minneapolis Jewish Family and Children's Service. And our dad's not exactly unhappy. Neither is his daughter-in-law. In fact, he described Donna as better than 9 daughters. He loved her to death. And this banquet, by the way, was for his volunteer work at Jewish Family and Children's Service. He was responsible for organizing transportation for all the seniors who were receiving services from JFCS. And he used to describe it that I'm in this big room, he said, I have a telephone and it's just me and 104 women. And he wasn't complaining. And then another little surprise, 2 years later, the Coen brothers, you might have heard of the Coen brothers, the Big Lebowski, Raising Arizona, Blood Simple, etc. They were casting a new film called A Serious Man. My sweetie finds out that the Coen brothers are looking for somebody to fill the part of one of 3 rabbis in the film. She sends that picture in as part of the casting application. We take our dad down to be interviewed. He's interviewed for 45 minutes. They bring him back, say, we'll call you. About a week later, they call, they say, you know, we've got the parts for the 3 rabbis cast already, but we really want your dad to be the Torah reader, one of the principals in the film. Would he be willing to do that? Would he be willing to come back and interview with the Coen brothers themselves? Of course, he's willing to do that. So goes back, talks with them for a while. He's cast. He did not have to join the union. I don't know why. And he takes the role of the Torah reader in the film. The film came out in 2009, fall of 2009. And he starts getting calls from people, not just in the United States, in Europe, in Israel, one from Australia, people calling the movie star. He used to go shopping at this point at Byerly's in St. Louis Park where he lived. And he said one time he's walking down the aisle and he hears 2 women behind him, older women, saying, shh, shh, there's the movie star. He didn't mind being in the film. And so this picture is of our dad on his last birthday, his 89th birthday. This was January 13th, 2010. This was at a little birthday party that we had for him at Zelo, a restaurant in downtown Minneapolis. And he's smiling. This is a guy who's been almost literally to hell and back. And his demeanor and personality was such that, oh, sure, he rarely said a bad word about anybody except for anybody that tried to cross him. That would be a big mistake. But he had this really the joy to be, this joy of life and joy of people. And he wanted not only the best for people, he looked for the best in people. That's a rare quality for anyone. So one side story, our dad came to this country with his family then. He was already a Talmudic scholar. He gets to the United States. The Talmudic scholars who are in this country essentially don't want to let another one in. So he sublimates all this intelligence and skill and knowledge, and he becomes a cap maker, somebody that made caps like that gentleman is wearing. He did that for 37 years. I don't know how he sat at a sewing machine to do this. He never started his own business. He rose to be a foreman at the last company he worked for. But like many parents who have a dream, and the dream is dashed for a variety of reasons, he wanted one of his children to do what he couldn't do in this country. So he pegged me, but he knew the other two, the older ones, didn't have the firepower. I mean, anybody could see that. Don't quote me. No, go ahead and quote me. I don't mind. And so I had to start studying with him at the age of 3.5. And the first things that we studied were not the Chumash, which is the first 5 books of what some people call the Old Testament. We had to study something called the Pirkei Avot. Pirkei Avot translates from the Hebrew as Ethics of Our Fathers, and it's basically snippets taken from the Talmud, ways you should live your life. Well, I'm studying with him. He was a great teacher with other people, but he and I, it didn't work real well. I would resist. I didn't even buy what I was studying with him. It didn't make sense to me. I preferred looking at what do we do here and now? What can we do for other people? How can we live better lives? That's not exactly what the Talmud was always concerned about. So a year later, it's the spring of 1955. It's a gorgeous Saturday afternoon. I want to be outside playing with my friends. Oh no, I've got to study. And so we were studying now a set of commentaries by a rabbi whose name has come down to us by the acronym of Rashi. And we're studying Rashi's, this set of commentaries was the qualities of God. They're found in the second book of the Old Testament called Shemot, or the Greek translation is Exodus. And Rashi in his commentary says that this book is saying that God is benevolent and kind and understanding and insightful. And I turned to our dad. He's very observant. I've never seen him get mad at anybody about anything before. I'm 4.5, and I turned to him and I said, well, I don't believe in that kind of God. This was, I didn't know it, this was a threat to his belief system. And he responded accordingly. He got real mad. He was right-handed. He used his right index finger and he stabbed the text repeatedly. Well, how can you doubt it? It's written right there. And remember, all of their friends up to this point were fellow survivors. I grew up around survivors. I grew up with their children, and I heard lots and lots of stories. And I was already doing my own reading at this point. And I said to our dad, well, what kind of God lets 1.5 million children be murdered? And I didn't know then, by the way, that the 1.5 million children of the approximately 6 million Jews who were murdered were 90% of the children of European Jewry at that time. Our dad was struck silent. I don't remember how long, 30 seconds, a minute. And he finally said, I really don't know. Unfortunately, I had to keep studying with him. And it just got, as my sweetie says, worse and worse. I kept fighting. And I told him, you know, I don't believe this. I don't accept this. It doesn't make sense to me. No, you've got to study it. You've got to do what I was supposed to do. And I said, no, I don't. But I mean, that's maybe a minor defeat in his life. This was a guy who really, who overcame incredible challenges. And he left a wonderful legacy. And so part of what I do, and I've done these presentations hundreds of times, what I'm trying to do is tell the story of what he went through and his family went through and what European Jewry went through. Because the point is, one of the points is that, well, why did all this happen? What fueled it? And what fueled it at base was prejudice. Prejudice, the old joke is prejudice is judging before you know the facts, and we know the facts. It was people turning against one another because they believed somebody else was the other, was inferior, was not anybody worthy of respect or honor as a human being. And so a lot of folks, when they hear this, and they hear about numbers like 6 million Jews out of 9.5 million Jews in Europe being murdered, about governments waging war against one another, they ask themselves sometimes, well, you know, I'm just one person. I couldn't do anything about any of this. I'd be powerless. And I would respectfully disagree with that view. I know you're surprised, because I believe each of you have far more power than you give yourselves credit for. How does that get translated here? You're with a group of friends, for example. One of your friends tells a joke that makes fun of somebody else because of some quality, their race, their religion, their creed, their color. You pick the category, it doesn't matter which category it is. But that person makes fun of somebody else in the group, everybody else laughs. You're left with three choices. You can either laugh with everybody else because you don't want to sound like you're out of sync with everybody. You may not agree with what was said, but you can't find the courage at the time to disagree. Or you just think, well, it's better this way. I'll laugh. They won't really know what I'm thinking. But by your laughing, what are you doing? You're endorsing that view. Choice two, you think there's sanctuary in remaining silent, not laughing with everybody else. You think that you're holding up your dignity by not giving that kind of voice to that poison that was put out. But you're doing the same thing, in effect, as if you would have laughed with everybody. You're endorsing the view because you're not saying anything different. You have a third choice. The third choice takes a great deal of courage sometimes, a lot of guts. You can turn to the person who told the joke. I'm using the word joke elastically. And you can say, I don't think that's funny. You wouldn't like that if somebody said that about you. Don't say that kind of garbage around me. Stop that. And you don't know if anybody in the group is going to pay attention to what you said, and even less likely that anybody might be influenced by what you said. And for any variety of reasons, shame, reason, insight, emotion, that they decide, you know what, I'm not going to put out that kind of garbage. The next time I hear that, I'm not going to join in. I'm going to oppose it. You don't know when that's going to happen. You don't know if it's going to happen. But if you don't say anything in opposition, it sure as hell isn't going to change. So if there's any lesson from the Shoah, that's one lesson. That basically anytime you hear anybody being singled out for being an undesirable, for being an other, I think you've got a duty to really step up for them. And by doing that, maybe you'll start attracting others who will start to believe the same way. And pretty soon, you've got a movement. Questions, please. Marty.
In that vein of stepping out, what do you know about people who did step out during the Shoah and protected Jewish families? Or, we only hear like the Schindler's List sort of stories. But what do we know about Germans who weren't willing to laugh at the joke?
The question is, what do you know of, you okay?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. What happened to people in Germany during World War II, or even before, who resisted the ethos that the that the German nation was putting out. Most of the time, they suffered, and they suffered horribly. There was a group, for example, called the Weiße Rose, the White Rose, in Germany. It was a group led by an academic and a group of students who started distributing leaflets. I think it was in Munich, and starting in Munich, opposing the German nation, the Nazi party. I'm sorry, I don't want to use the acronym, it would be meaningless if I did. And encouraging people just to think about what's going on and to realize it's not right. Eventually, all but 2 of the members of that group were executed. The oldest surviving member died 3 weeks ago. But they were murdered. Some of the murderers were not nicely done. They were beheaded. And this is what, Germany could not tolerate any opposition, any dissent. So that was a group, in effect, that opposed what the nation was doing. And unfortunately, almost all of them paid. In fact, all of them did pay grievously. They were all imprisoned. Only 2 of them, as I recall, survived the war. And the oldest survivor, we only lost 3 weeks ago. The other thing that was done to discourage people from opposing the party was Goering, who was the minister of propaganda, very powerful position, 3rd most powerful position in the government. He came up with this saying, this idea, doing the will of the Führer. There was nothing put in writing specifically. Most edicts did not come from Hitler himself, but Goebbels came up with this idea that all German citizens, which of course excluded anybody that wasn't considered an Aryan, which I'll get to, your role is to promote the well-being and power and extent of this government, this nation. That's your role. And it was embedded in people so that they automatically acted this way. With rare exceptions, they didn't question backing this murderous regime. It's okay to do. So, and then there's the countermeasure, which is, for example, in Poland, or the general government, which was the western portion of Poland that was controlled by Germany during the war, there was an ordinance that was enacted in Warsaw that what was the consequence if you killed a Jew, if you, a citizen, killed a Jew? Notice I didn't use the word penalty. The consequence was that you were given a 2.5 kilogram packet of sugar, which was in very short supply for most civilians. It was to encourage the murderous behavior, to make it acceptable, to make it the norm. So most people who stood up in Germany, in any of the areas controlled by the Third Reich, wasn't a pretty picture. Good question. Yes.
Was your father, or how long did it take for him to find out that most of his family was gone? When did he learn this?
The first, he first got word that his 2 sisters were behind the Iron Curtain. He first got word of that 9 years after the war ended in 1954. And I remember that because they started sending parcels. They, meaning my parents, started sending parcels, food parcels, to my two sisters, my 2 aunts, thinking that they needed it, which they were right. That was the first time he knew anything about them. He found out eventually about the murder of almost everyone in his family. He found that out in 1948 while in Banbury, because the International Red Cross was making the rounds. And they also provided information to anybody, that the information they had, which was very limited, about, are you looking for information about your family? And he found out at that time, he found out about his parents, and his grandparents murdered in Auschwitz, which is pretty devastating. It wasn't the news, obviously, he wanted, but he lived basically with this lack of information. Because as far as he was concerned, everybody disappeared from the face of the earth in his family, with the exception of his brother, who he knew went to Palestine and died in May of 1948. The others he didn't know. So, I mean, take that and just think, okay, that indecision, I'm sorry, that lack of information, what does that do to somebody? Worry, stress, anxiety. He was real close with his sisters, and yet to be left with no word. We asked him years later if he'd be willing to go back to Europe to visit Munkaj, to visit Mauthausen, to visit the areas that he worked in. And he said, there's nothing to go back to. It's all gone. And there was no dissuading. Another good question.
Can I just say a couple things? And I have to be careful on,
Oh, yeah.
I have to be careful what I say because I'm a crier and I can't start back because there's no end to it. Like, for his, asking about when did he know about his family? That was in the time that I knew him. Things like that, things that couldn't previously be known, were among the few things that he did not know. And I thought this was the coolest thing ever. He told me, that he made a point to learn something new every day, and that he made a point to keep a schedule. And he could run circles around me, and he was 40 years older than I was. And I just thought that that's such a cool thing, because when you think about learning, I think learning, the things we're learning today are kind of different than what we should be learning sometimes. Because when you think about the other, the person who's made fun of, or who, is being sent to a concentration camp, or being, having trouble at school. You think about being the other, we're all the other. Every single person is in this room is the other. I'm sure no one in here weighs the same, is the same height. You may be Christian, Jew, agnostic. You may be here for the history part of the talk, and religion has nothing to do with it. And so I just think it's really important that we, of course, I'm the strangest person in the world, but we all have our ways. We all do what we do and believe what we believe, but other cultures and other lives and other religions, they should really be a source of fascination, something to learn about, not something to fear. And then one other thing that I wanted to say, he did get his Screen Actors membership.
Oh, I thought he didn't need it.
He did. Well, he didn't to work there, but he got it anyway. So,
He got that a year before he died. One further answer to your question, which is, our dad, when he was 86, I believe, he had an occlusion in one of his arteries. He had to have stents put in. And so he went with my sweetie to be interviewed by one of the nurses to get a family history. And so she would ask him, well, is there a history of cancer in your family? Is there a history of respiratory illness? And he said, I don't know. And he kept saying, I don't know. And so she finally, if I got the story right, she finally said, well, why don't you know? And he said, well, all my family was murdered by 1944.
So she was
And-
trying, this, excuse me. No, she was trying to, this was the health history, the family history. And this really sent a chill through me, you know, because we're going through pages and pages and pages of the packet to return to for the cardiac program, for the rehabilitation. And he says, there's just nothing here that I know. Nothing here that I can fill out. And I remember that the girl who was assigned, young woman who was assigned to help him with this rehab, she just lost it. She said, you know, I've never had anyone say that to me. Because in the beginning, she was saying, just guess, do the best you can. And he said, no, I don't know. And when you think about that, you know, when you think about your the family that you have today, however large, or it may be, you know, aunts and elephants, aunts and uncles, or
Maybe that too.
yeah, or relatives, or, you know, so many generations don't live together now, and some don't even unfortunately know what's going on. But choosing not to know or not to keep in touch is so different from just not knowing, and really never having a way to know. And that's another thing that struck me, that even I did not think about that until that day.
And why would you?
Yeah, I mean,
I mentioned, by the way, before we get to the next question, I mentioned just in passing, I mentioned about Aryan, the German ideal. Anybody ever met an Aryan? I'm sorry, I have this in my hand, little tool to use. I asked the question, has anyone ever met an Aryan? Why do I ask the question before anybody answers? Because the way Hitler stylized and structured German society was the highest and best level in this hierarchy were who he called the Aryans, blonde-haired, blue-eyed, socially adept, intellectually advanced, athletically gifted, the pinnacle of human development. And he called them the Aryans. And the Aryans were the ones in his mind who were entitled to every benefit that the German state could provide. And everybody then fell below that. And of course, the Jews were at the very bottom of the heap. But still, my question, anybody ever met an Aryan? Blonde hair, blue eye?
We're all Scandinavian up here, so yeah.
Not an Aryan.
So.
No, stop. Don't assume. Have you met an Aryan?
I couldn't say officially, but looking back, this is back when I was in school in Iowa, looking back on a couple of families that came into our school for a while. Some of those kids, I would say, certainly looked like the way you're describing, but also acted in a very arrogant way, arrogant manner. And they were just old enough to have been indoctrinated in those teachings.
There you go.
So that's
Indoctrination.
why I say that.
Because they might have been guided by their parents or somebody else to carry those attributes. They may have had those physical features, but the reason, respectfully, you've never met an Aryan is because the Aryans were a mythic Nordic race. It never existed, no matter how many Scandinavians or Norwegians or Finns. No such thing in real life as an Aryan, but this is just part of the German structure of society. We're going to set up this false goal, this false model, and you better adhere to it, or too bad. And by the way, if you give any objection to the fact that there's no basis for this, you're just feeding us a bunch of malarkey, you're going to be in trouble. So it wasn't an effort to put you on the spot. It's just people use the term still, Aryans. They still have this view of people who are Aryans. It's nice to have it, but there are lots of other fantasies that people can carry as well.
This
Yes.
may be a strange question, but like on a very small scale during COVID, you know, we all are washing our hands more than we did beforehand, and you know, that's kind of a lingering attribute of that time. Did your parents have any sort of like little quirks or habits or things that made them kind of those traumatic? Even just like little things.
Well, first of all, what's washing hands? Sorry. You're asking a question about were survivors, did they have characteristics or capacities that were so-called different from other people?
Or habits.
And you also started to say PTSD. Okay. People like to stereotype survivors as being damaged goods, as being critically affected by what happened to them, such that they exhibit all the signs of PTSD and have it, in fact. But not all survivors responded to what happened to them in the same way. Some, for example, went into the war being very observant, believing absolutely in the religious doctrines that they were taught, and they came out at the end of the war and they jettisoned all those because they saw what some human beings could do. In fact, Elie Wiesel and others said the problem for us survivors was not adapting to life when we came back. He said that was easy. It was adapting to death that we lived with every day. So, I mean, with my mother especially, let's choose her. When I was about 7, I saw one of these rare photographs that came out of Europe pre-war of my family, and it was of a girl who was 9 years old, typical European studio photo, black drapes, lighting diffused. She's holding a doll and she's staring at the camera with the most haunted look in her eyes. And I asked her dad, "Who is this?" And he said, "That's your mother." And I said, you know, classic loyalty denial, "That can't be her." Well, I believe she went into the war as damaged goods. Our dad described her as being far more intelligent than he was. But there was something wrong with her, I think, going into the war. You know, her experiences were such, they were horrendous. She truly probably had PTSD. It never was diagnosed. But she was somebody. She made conscious decisions of how to treat people, good or otherwise. And this is somebody who, if anybody on earth should have known why you don't treat people prejudicially, horribly, because it's not right, she should have known that. But she actually chose, consciously decided how she was going to treat people. My so-called 2 brothers, they could do no wrong as far as she was concerned. I, who was supposed to be a girl, they said when I was born, and it was my fault it wasn't. That's a joke, of course. I was seen as the pariah. I was seen as absolutely no good. And she displayed her favor by, let's put it this way. It started by using belts, and then it was an iron rod. And then one time it was a hammer that she used, and this is before I'm 10. So all this gave me reason that before I left their home, and I got out as fast as I could by the time I was 17, because people wouldn't believe me when I would say what they were doing. Our dad was a party to this, for whatever reasons. But I used to say, here's what's going on, you know, they're abusing me. I didn't use the word abuse. Nobody would believe it because these people were the ultimate people to aspire to be in their communities. And so finally I realized the only way I'm going to describe this is the one thing I've learned growing up in this home was how not to parent. So, and she did this later on to fellow survivors. She would treat some favorably and others, I mean, she would treat like shit, forgive me for saying it. And I would see, and I grew up with these people, and I would see them later in life, and they would come up, I'd see them downtown Minneapolis. And I'm delighted to see them. I mean, they're part of my past, but they're wonderful people. And almost every one of them, the women, would say, I don't understand it. I don't know why your mother won't talk to me anymore. I don't know why she treats me this way. And my only answer was, I don't know the reason. All I can tell you is, this isn't the first time I've heard this. So, and there were some survivors, they blocked to a large extent what they went through. They didn't want to share it with their children, with their other family members. And of course, you can run from the past, but Faulkner already addressed that you can't avoid the past. In fact, it's not even past. It's not an accurate quote. Some survivors certainly exhibited PTSD. Our dad did not. That was to his credit, he didn't. But they responded, because they're different human beings, in different ways to this. That's a good question.
Good. Good answer.
Thank you. Other questions?
Ken, Jerry Moyna
Yes.
here. Great presentation.
And I'm
You hear me okay?
That it didn't exist.
Hmm.
Why is there such denial of that with some people?
Well, are you asking why are there Holocaust deniers, or are you asking why there's this general disregard? Let's use Germany as an example. Start there. Germany after the war, at least Western Germany, was heavily involved in rebuilding itself with Allied assistance. Germans largely did not want to admit their culpability in what was carried out in their names. And so for a long time, starting with Edna, the idea was, we're not going to talk about the past. It didn't really happen. We're going to focus on building the future. What does that do to somebody when they start denying part of themselves? Doesn't leave them in a good spot. Germany wouldn't even acknowledge what Germany did to the Jews, to the Roma, the proper name for the Gypsies, to a wide range of human beings that were deemed to be lives not worth living. It only started to address it seriously around 1960. Now, Germany also did set up reparations for some survivors starting in around 52 or 53, but they wouldn't admit fault or culpability. They said this was done by the people before us. And it's like, well, you're not 7 years old. What are you talking about? But it just was an idea. We can't stand to face this about ourselves. Interestingly, the first generation after the adult Germans who were involved in the Third Reich, that first generation starting around 65 started raising questions to their parents. What did you do during the war, Daddy? Why did you not do this? Why did you take part in this? How could you do this? And that second generation, a different second generation, which is the first generation following those who were alive and active and culpable in what Germany did during World War II. Those are the ones who opened the door to a lot of others, including in the United States, to start asking the questions about, for example, why did we fly over Auschwitz in 43 and 44, the Army Air Force, and not drop bombs on the rail lines or on the camp to destroy what was going on? Those questions didn't get raised until later, and a lot of those questions still haven't been answered. There's so many different aspects of what you're asking. I mean, I think that's on the plus side. What has study about the Shoah done in part? What it's done is make more people aware. Not only are people different and you have to, or you don't have to, but it's wise to take into account those differences and respect them. But it's like, how do we treat not just other people? How do we treat ourselves better? How can we, if we start marking other people as less than human or undesirables? It's really, if there's one benefit from it, there's that one. Now, there's a Shoah historian named Raoul Hilbert. He's now gone, unfortunately. He was the first major historian about the Shoah. Brilliant historian, but the material is really, really dark that he studied. And he was giving a presentation in the mid-90s in Maryland, I believe in Baltimore. And somebody in the audience asked him the question, is there anything to learn about or learn from the Shoah? And his answer was, I hope not. We've come a long way since then. That's a start of an answer to your question. Hang on, Marty.
Yeah.
Okay.
Have you been back to Germany or to Hungary?
The question is, have I been back to
Or have you?
Germany or Czechoslovakia or Hungary? No, not yet. We're talking about doing it. We wanted to take our days, as I mentioned.
He said there's nothing to go back to. I have to say subconsciously that's had quite a dramatic effect. Because even though there's the Mark Twain line about being amazed about
How much his father knew between the time Twain was 17 and 19. I really resist because of that. It's like, well, he's right. There is nothing to go back to. But that's a narrowly focused, even a jaundiced view of things. We're hoping to a different answer.
Would you go back specifically for?
There's a let's go to Germany on vacation.
And attitude, and then there's the let's go back and look at my history. And, you know, I mean, I can see two very different trips there.
Let me give you a very contemporary answer to that question. And the question is, would you go back for the purpose of travel and entertainment, or would you go back for the purpose of exploring your family history or history in general? There is a series, and this is somebody that hasn't watched television in 45 or 50 years. There's a series called Vienna Blood that came out first in 2019. It's on PBS. I know I don't get any royalties for this, but I'm endorsing. It's a series about a Freudian psychologist and a detective in Vienna who together investigate various murders and crimes. The setting in Vienna, Don has been to Vienna. I haven't. The setting, most of the buildings that are abandoned are gorgeous. They're incredible. The art that's presented, this is during the Jugendstil period between about 1895 and 1910. It's beyond beautiful. Before Art Deco, incredible design. But at the same time, this series gives hints now and then about the anti-Semitism that was and still is endemic in Vienna. And so, I mean, we saw all 18 episodes
We
in,
binged it.
in 4 days, 4 nights.
Yeah, we binged it.
And the idea was, I would love to go there, but I know it's history. And the series did make, some reference to that. There were occasional references, Jew doctor, for example.
The main, one of the main character,
Yeah, Max Lieberman, who's the psychiatrist, is Jewish. The detective, Oscar, is not Jewish, but and the series treats very lightly the degree of anti-Semitism that was present in Vienna then, based on everything that I've read, and I've read a few things about it. But it still covers it to some extent. It hints at it, and sometimes it's more overt. I would love to go see Vienna, but I know if we go, that history isn't going to be far from the mind, although, you know, you gotta have a mind that works, so I don't have to worry about that. But, yeah, for a lot of reasons, but the history especially is compelling, and it really would be nice to go to Munkash, to see what's left. I mean, half of that city's population were Jews. Half out of the 30,000. It was a very poor community, but it was a very center of learning. Not on, well, almost to the extent of Lodz, which was one of the pillars of Jewish academic effort in Europe. I'd love to. I just know there are lots of ghosts, and you can't escape those ghosts.
There's also the film, Woman of Gold,
Which was done on one of the Klimt paintings, and a woman whose family owned it and then made efforts to get restitution and get the painting returned. She's in Vienna. She was from Vienna. They go into Vienna. What they face from the municipalities, from the bureaucrats, from the attorneys, you can just taste the anti-Semitism, that we're not, you know, we don't have to do anything for you. How is it you're even alive? Long answer to the question.
We have a question from the chat from Jerome. He asked, were your parents grateful for their survival, better for their families' deaths? 2 questions there.
I know who that is.
Yeah.
It's actually an excellent question. I mean, number one, who wouldn't be grateful to survive unless they had a death wish? And there were many survivors who came out of the war, and suicide rates were relatively high when they find out that their past, their families are all gone. I'm going to answer the question a bit obliquely. At the same time, the highest birth rates of anywhere in the world were found in the displaced persons camps, where Shoah survivors were sent between 1947 and 1949, 2 to 3 times higher than the birth rate anywhere else in the world. So there was a desire to embrace life, to restart it, but not everybody did that. I can't actually say that my mother was grateful for surviving. Here's maybe a catalyst that measures that. You know, I was a bit inquisitive when I was growing up, and being around all these survivors, I would not only listen to them, especially when they didn't want me to be listening to them, so I'd hide under a stairway or something, but I would ask lots of questions. And some survivors discussed, of course they're grateful to live. Of course, they're glad to be in the United States, where it truly to them was a land of milk and honey, and opened its arms to them. They didn't go into the history of why the doors were closed for so long or why, but they all said, but it's not all. Many of them said, but it's not home. It's not Europe. It's not the Yiddishkeit, which is the Yiddish phrase for this whole world of Jewish learning and life. It's not that. So they were grateful, but there was always this hole that they couldn't fill. They couldn't fill it through their children, or if they were lucky to have grandchildren. It was really a mixed bag for them. And you know, when you've lost everything, how do you recover? And to what degree do you recover? I hope that works, Jerry. Good question.
Well, one of the proudest things about Dad and Celia were becoming citizens. This was their home. And I never knew Celia, but the man I knew was a happy man. His eyes laughed, his whole face lit up. And a really important thing that he said to me, I'm like, I clearly I wouldn't survive you know, I know that I wouldn't.
Nobody knows.
And he says, the secret is you got to have a buddy. You know, you've got to have a friend, you've got to have somebody to watch your back, and you watch his back. You know, two blankets are better than one. You know, just, and I thought that is so true of all of us, just the need for friendship. And, you know, isn't that really the key to life, is we gotta have a buddy.
Our dad, for years and years, would say that survival during the Shoah was really due to pure dumb luck, nothing else. And he insisted on that for years and years. And I understood, I mean, he told me stories. He's on a work gang in Poland. They're building a road, they're giving a break. And so they're standing, the prisoners, only because they were born the wrong religion, are standing by the side of the road, leaning on their tools. And he said an SS man came by and struck the guy immediately to his left with a shovel, killed him, threw the shovel on the guy, and kept walking. And our dad said a second earlier or a second later, that could have been me. It wasn't until years later that what Donna was just talking about, our dad said, and just one day out of the blue, he said, you know, the real secret to survival in the Shoah was you got to have a buddy. He said, 2 heads are better than 1, 4 hands are better than 2, 4 legs are better than 2. You can watch out for each other because nobody else was going to, and that improved your likelihood of survival. It wasn't a guarantee, it wasn't insurance, but it was a pretty wise approach if you could find somebody that you could trust, because people were fighting for their own survival.
Other questions?
I have one question.
Yes.
I mean, I don't have any questions. Did your father ever comment on what are your thoughts now when we're seeing Shoahs happening all over the world, since right after World War II? You know, right now we're sitting having dinner and watching whatever's happening in Syria, of course, Ukraine, things are happening in China, Vietnam, you name it, all along, Africa. Did your father ever comment?
The question is, did our dad say anything about the craziness that was observed in the world around? Fair summary?
Yeah, it's more than craziness, it's basically repeating what was happening to him. And what happened to his family, not.
Respectfully, it's not repeating. We've only gotten better at genocide.
Oh, there you go.
But what he said was he recognized that there's all kinds of crazy stuff that goes on in the world about people being inhumane, to one another. He said that his job was not to be part of that, to do exactly the opposite. And that's part of the reason that he had the following that he did. When we had his funeral at the synagogue that we had his funeral at, the place was filled to the gills. He had this following from so many, 4 generations were well represented there. I don't know, 900 people. I mean, it was amazing because our dad said, I'm not going to be that way. He made the choice of what he was going to do. And he said, I can't fix the world, but I can sure do my part to fix my world. That was one of his things. What are my thoughts? You know, I have a wish, and then I have an observation. The wish is, of course, it's in everybody's interest to get along, to work together, to cooperate, to support one another. Isn't that what I think evolution has equipped us to be? But then I also have this pessimistic view that I believe that evolution has also equipped us for survival benefit to basically look only for the benefit for ourselves. And as our dad would say, the hell with everybody else. in a different context. And I believe that people act prejudicially because they're wired to act that way. It takes choice. It takes an active effort not to be that way. Now, I mean, I've read studies that go both ways about that prejudicial urge and the prejudicial conduct, that it's innate, no, it's learned, no, it's periodic. Well, I really think that evolution has rewarded us to treat things prejudicially just to increase our own survival. Is there a place for it now? Well, maybe there isn't, but tell our brains that. So I think both are probably true, and lucky us, we get to live with it and try to make the best that we can possibly can. And that's, I think, really working together with other people and making sure that we do the right thing for ourselves and for others. I'm not on a soapbox, it just sounds like I am.
Well, I just feel that everything is repeating itself as far as letting refugees from other world. I think the United States was maybe took the most refugees, but they were pretty close to Jews from Europe, as many other places in the world. I feel like right now we're pretty close to refugees. They're not really letting people in. I mean, it's very nice what you're doing for the Ukrainians, and I'm all for it. I don't understand why they're holding anybody, having bad feelings about it. But look at what's happening in Syria, and those people are not being accepted as the closer to Aryan people. Sorry to say that, or Africans, or South Americans, Central Americans.
This person is saying that she fears that history is a cyclical process and that we're repeating a lot of the stuff that we did before. So my question for you is, what if you're right?
And I am.
Okay, you're right. What are you going to do about it?
That's the thing that bugs me the most, is the fact that I can sit and watch it all happening on TV and I'm not doing anything. Because nobody did anything. I mean, a lot of people knew that it's happening. World War II, and chose not to do anything, chose to not let children in. I mean, just because of racism.
You
Not
watch
because
it, and
it's
then
not-
during a commercial, you don't get a sandwich.
That's I just watched that whole documentary of Channel 2, the US and the Holocaust.
Oh, Ken Burns?
Yes, yes, it was fascinating. But wasn't, not all of them knew, but the fact that there was so much racism here, anti-Jewish.
So fascinating in the way that,
All the information that came out.
right, but I mean, fascinating the way that you come on the scene of an auto accident and you cover your eyes, but you still park your fingers. Actually, to some extent, you're not doing anything. The first step is to be aware of what's going on, because you can't do anything about something you're not aware of. Most people, many people will turn away and not wish to acknowledge that kind of stuff that goes on. You at least are aware of it. So now your question for yourself was, okay, now what am I going to do? I can't stand aside and do nothing. So my question for myself is, what do I do? And that's what my charge to you is. Somebody here, Troy.
So I've been around aging people as I get older, and a constant or consistent theme I hear with people who lose their parents and siblings, that lose their last one in their family, is that even though they're surrounded by children and grandchildren, great-grandchildren, that they feel a great sense of loneliness once they've lost their people in their generation and older, that there is no one else, that they're the last surviving member of it. Having been through under the staircase, listening to the story, how did that first generation that survived deal with that sense of loneliness and move forward?
The question is, how did the survivors, if they had that sense of being adrift from their past because their past was gone, how did they deal with it? Well, let's take a look at what happened with survivors in the United States post-World War II, who might have been advised or gone on their own to get psychological help. What happened almost in all cases for the first 15 years or so is, number one, the psychology and psychiatry movements didn't know how to deal with them because they'd never dealt with this level of trauma and horrific events that a human being deals with. So most of the time, those mental therapists would kind of throw up their hands and not do anything, especially not listen. And the survivors, and I'm generalizing, what the survivors would do is say, oh, you know, he's a nice person, he listened to me, but I wouldn't even tell him about being in Auschwitz because this person had no concept of what I was talking about. And so the survivors then, they didn't feel that they were inferior, something was really wrong with them. Their point was, these people aren't ready to listen to me. So what they'll do in some case, for example, is what our dad and another person did. There it is. That soon after coming to the United States, our dad and his family were in New York for 3 months. The Joint Distribution Committee, which was a nonprofit organization that helped refugees and survivors and was not a drug cartel. Ah, you're a slow. Shipped them to Minneapolis to say, we've got a job for you and we found housing for you. Go there. And they did. They got to Minneapolis and they, like almost every other survivor who came to Minneapolis then, found that the local Jewish community, with very rare exceptions, turned its back on them. Because they were viewed as, you're reminding us of what could happen to us. We think that you were basically like sheep to the slaughter, which of course did not happen. That, you know, we could never be what you are, so we want nothing to do with you. So our dad and his other survivors said, basically, if that's how they're going to be, fine. We're going to create our own community. We're going to create our own family. And our dad and his other survivor founded something called the New Home Club that had 200 to 250 survivor families as members. And they would get together regularly. They would have picnics. They would have meetings where they would argue. They were the first group in Minneapolis, for example, to start funding, and by 1957, put up the first Shoah memorial in Minneapolis. They said, we're not going to give in. You know, you're trying to treat us as what we were treated as in Europe. We're not going to buy that. It happened in Minneapolis. It didn't happen in St. Paul. The St. Paul Jewish community, by and large, welcomed the survivors who came there with open arms. I still don't know the reason why the difference between the communities. And I've heard different theories. I still don't know. But so, I mean,
Leaned on
people
each other.
say again.
So they learned from it, they leaned on each other to try and get through it.
I think that's a fair description. They leaned on one another. That's why I use the term community. They formed their own community. Now, I said they formed their own family, but there are different associations that some people have with the word family, so that's a little more loaded. Community works. Not all survivors were like that. A lot of survivors, I grew up knowing a number of them, they isolated themselves. They wouldn't become part of any community. Their children, they treated basically as their refuge, as what was going to cure them, was going to fix them. And the children, that wasn't the child's role. So some survivors they gave in to this feeling of helplessness. They wouldn't do anything about it, again, because of the horrible experiences they went through. There was a lot of mistrust for other people that was generated. The response was spectrum wide. There was no single way that a survivor would respond to a certain set of circumstances, and it wouldn't be necessarily the same as another survivor. They all did it differently. What did they do with their children? Some survivors believe we absolutely need to tell our children what their history is. And they need to know about this, even though their children will tell them so-called age-appropriate ways. Other survivors said, no, I don't want them thinking that they're different, or they're from something different, or they came from this horrific event. I want them to assimilate into society, to become Americans, not to have this cloud hanging over them. Well, when you don't tell somebody their history, and you don't give them a chance to find out their history, they can be somewhat adrift. So, but that was the choice that each of these people made, and they had their own good reasons. I guess the answer is not, it depends, it's just spectrum wide what the responses were. And I think it's fully understandable. Good question.
And we never stopped to think about, at some point in time, all of our families were immigrants. We're all from immigrant families.
Thank you, Linda.
Unless you're Native American.
Well, Native Americans crossed either the Bering Strait.
Complicated thing, but we'll go.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think we'll go ahead and transition. If you have more questions for Ken, go ahead and come on up. If you have questions from the chat, how can they contact you?
Give them my email address.
Okay,
Which
sounds
is,
great.
oh, you got my email address.
Yeah.
You can just post it.
Perfect.
There was, can we entertain just one more question?
Absolutely,
Somebody
yes.
had a hand up. I'm sorry.
Absolutely. I just wanted to give anyone, welcome to leave if you'd like to get on.
Well, maybe not. It's maybe
I
another,
was waiting by.
That's fine too.
maybe it's another one of my illusions.
No, that's
Everybody, thank you so much for being here. Great questions, great attendance. Thank you. Thank you.